The air inside the villa is stagnant, thick with the smell of sweat and fear. Outside, the sky over Rome is beginning to lighten with the gray creep of dawn, but here, in the shadows, a dynasty is taking its final gasping breath. It is June 68 AD. A man huddles in a dark corner of a servant's room, clutching a dagger. His hands, once adorned with the heavy gold rings of an emperor, are trembling violently. He hears the thundering hooves of the Praetorian Guard approaching, the very men sworn to protect him, now coming to drag him through the streets like a common criminal. This terrified creature is Nero. He is the last of the Julio-Claudians, the great bloodline that traced its ancestry to the goddess Venus and the hero Aeneas. Just a few generations ago, his great-great-grandfather, Augustus, walked these hills as a god on earth, turning a city of brick into a city of marble. But the marble has since been stained. It has been cracked by the paranoia of Tiberius, shattered by the madness of Caligula, and poisoned by the wives of Claudius. As the soldiers break down the door, Nero drives the steel into his throat, whispering, "What an artist dies with me." But the art he leaves behind is a masterpiece of ruin. This is not just the story of an empire's rise, it is the autopsy of a family that devoured itself. If you wish to walk these marble halls and witness the tragic cost of absolute power, I invite you to join us on this journey by subscribing as we peel back the imperial purple to reveal the blood beneath. The Mask of Marble. The storm broke over the villa at Nola on the 19th of August, 14 AD. Inside the stifling heat of the bedchamber, the breathing of the most powerful man on earth was becoming a rattle. Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome, lay dying. He was 76 years old. His skin, once bronzed by the campaigns of his youth, was now pale and spotted with age like old parchment. Around his bed stood the nervous elite of the empire, generals, senators, and scribes, waiting for the final exhalation that would shake the foundations of the world. But Augustus was not looking at them. His eyes, clouded with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, were fixed on his wife, Livia. For 40 years they had ruled Rome together. He was the face of the empire, the first citizen who had turned a chaotic republic of mud and brick into a monolithic empire of marble. She was the steel spine behind the throne, the woman who whispered counsel in the dead of night when the senators had gone home. Now, as the end approached, Augustus signaled for a mirror. With trembling hands, he arranged his hair one last time. He straightened his jaw. Even in death, vanity consumed him. He looked at his friends and asked a question that would echo through history. "Have I played the part well? Then applaud as I exit." It was a chilling admission. To Augustus, the Roman Empire was not a divine mandate, it was a stage play. It was a performance of order, masking a reality of absolute control. But as the applause of his sycophants filled the room, a terrible silence lingered in the corners. The emperor was dying, yes, but who would take his place? The room should have been filled with his sons, strapping young men ready to inherit the eagles. But there were no sons. There were only ghosts. To understand the tragedy that was about to unfold, we must step back from the deathbed and look at the graveyard that Augustus built. He had spent his entire reign obsessed with legacy. He wanted a dynasty that would last 1,000 years. He married his only daughter, Julia, off like a broodmare to his best generals, hoping to breed a successor. But a curse seemed to hang over the blood of Caesar. First, there was Marcellus, his golden-haired nephew. The people loved him. Augustus groomed him, walked with him in the forum, and prepared him for the throne. Then a mysterious fever took him at 19. Next came Agrippa, the loyal general, the iron fist to Augustus's velvet glove, dead of sickness. Then came the grandsons, Gaius and Lucius. They were the princes of youth, their faces stamped on coins from Syria to Spain. They were the future.
and one by one the lights went out. Lucius died of a sudden illness in Marsilia. Gaius was wounded in a minor skirmish in Armenia and withered away months later. Rome began to whisper, how could one man be so fortunate in war and so cursed in fatherhood? Eyes turned to the Empress Livia. The Romans were superstitious, but they were also cynical. They noticed a pattern. Every time an heir who was not of Livia's bloodline rose to prominence, they fell. Every obstacle that stood between the throne and Livia's own son from a previous marriage, Tiberius, seemed to vanish.
Was it the vagaries of ancient medicine, where a simple infection could kill a king? Or was it the poisoned figs that rumors claimed Livia plucked from the garden with her own hands? We will never know for certain. But in the villa at Nola, as Augustus took his final breath, the answer no longer mattered. The golden boys were dead. The stage was empty. And stepping out from the shadows to take the leading role was a man Augustus had never loved. A man he had once exiled to the Rock of Rhodes. A man who hated the people of Rome as much as they hated him. Tiberius. The transition of power is a fragile thing. As the news of Augustus's death spread, couriers whipped their horses down the Appian Way, racing toward Rome. The illusion of the Republic, the idea that the Senate still ruled, was about to be tested. If the army revolted, the civil wars would return. If the Senate refused to swear loyalty, the streets would run with blood. But Livia had prepared for this moment. Before the public announcement was even made, she had surrounded the villa with soldiers. She issued orders in her husband's name while his body was still warm. She was ensuring that the transition to her son would be seamless. But Tiberius, now 55 years old, did not rush to claim the crown. He sat in the corner of the room, silent, brooding. He was a brilliant general, a man who had conquered the Alps and secured the Rhine, yet he possessed a soul consumed by resentment. He knew he was the second choice. He knew Augustus had only adopted him because there was no one else left. As the Praetorian Guard hailed him as emperor, Tiberius looked at them with a cold, detached sneer. He was inheriting the world, but to him it felt like a prison sentence. And his first act as emperor would prove that the golden age of Augustus was over. The age of the knife had begun. The funeral of Augustus was a spectacle designed to freeze the blood of any man thinking of rebellion. His body was carried on a bier of gold and ivory, hidden from view, while a wax effigy of the emperor in triumphal robes stared out at the weeping crowds with unblinking eyes. Incense smoke choked the air of the forum, masking the smell of the burning pyre. An eagle was released from the flames, soaring into the sky to symbolize his soul ascending to join the gods. But down on the ground, amidst the ash and the wailing, the new reality was setting in. The Senate met to confirm Tiberius's powers, and the performance continued. Tiberius stood before the gathered elite, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a severe face that seemed permanently etched with disapproval. He played the reluctant servant. He told the senators that the empire was too vast for one mind, that the burden was too heavy. "I am unequal to the task," he claimed, suggesting the Senate should resume its old authority. It was a trap. The senators were terrified. They knew that if they agreed with him and took back power, he would have them killed for treason. If they begged him too enthusiastically to rule, he would have them killed for sycophancy. They walked a razor's edge, sweating in their togas, until one exasperated senator finally shouted, "Caesar, how long will you allow the state to remain without a head?" Tiberius finally accepted the powers he had already seized, but his reign began with a splash of blood that stained the new regime immediately. On a remote island called Planacia, the last surviving grandson of Augustus, a brute of a man named Agrippa Posthumus, was suddenly executed by a centurion. When the officer returned to Rome to report the deed to Tiberius, the emperor looked at him with cold, dead eyes and said, "I gave no such order." It was a lie, or perhaps a half-truth orchestrated by his mother Livia. It was the first crime of the new principate. It sent a message: the bloodline of Augustus was being pruned to ensure Tiberius had no rivals. But there was one rival Tiberius could not simply execute. On the muddy, rain-soaked frontier of the Rhine, commanding the largest army in the empire, was his nephew, Germanicus. If Tiberius was the dark moon, Germanicus was the sun. He was young, handsome, and charismatic, and married to Agrippina the Elder, the direct granddaughter of Augustus. He possessed the magic that Tiberius lacked, the love of the people. When the legions on the Rhine heard that Augustus was dead, they mutinied. They refused to swear loyalty to the sullen old man in Rome. They offered their swords to Germanicus. They wanted to march on Italy and make him emperor. It was the moment Tiberius had feared for 20 years.
Germanicus, however, was loyal to a fault. In a display of theatrical honor that would become legend, he stood before the mutinous troops, drew his sword, and held it to his own chest, declaring he would rather die than betray his uncle. The soldiers, shamed by his virtue, backed down. But for Tiberius, watching from the shadows of the Palatine Hill, this act of loyalty was almost worse than rebellion. It proved that Germanicus held the power of life and death over the empire. He held the hearts of the army, and he was married to Agrippina, a woman of iron strength who marched with the legions, tended to the wounded, and carried the blood of the divine Augustus in her veins. She was a constant, living reminder of Tiberius's inadequacy. The relationship between the emperor and his nephew became a poisonous dance. To the public, they were father and son, the ruler and his heir. In private, they were the jailer and the prisoner. Tiberius could not kill Germanicus. The mob would tear the palace apart, so he decided to remove him from his power base. He recalled Germanicus to Rome for a triumph, a glorious parade to celebrate his victories against the German barbarians. The triumph was spectacular. Chariots laden with spoils, captives in chains, and Germanicus standing tall in the victor's chariot, his 5 children sitting around him like cherubs. The crowd roared his name until the very stones of the Capitol shook. Tiberius sat on the dais, forcing a thin, tight smile, while envy ate a hole in his stomach. He saw what the people saw, a golden age waiting to happen. And he knew that as long as Germanicus lived, he would be nothing more than a placeholder. Shortly after the parade, Tiberius gave Germanicus a new command. He sent him to the east, to the rich provinces of Syria and Egypt. It seemed like a promotion, a chance to govern the wealthiest part of the empire. But Tiberius also sent a new governor to Syria to watch over him, a man named Gnaeus Calpurnius Piso. Piso was a hard, nasty aristocrat who hated Germanicus. Before leaving Rome, it is whispered that Tiberius had a private meeting with Piso. No records exist of what was said. But when Germanicus arrived in the east, he found not a subordinate, but an enemy who blocked his orders, insulted his wife, and undermined his authority at every turn. The Golden Prince had walked into a trap, and the sun was about to set in the east. The Island of Terror. In the ancient city of Antioch, the air was heavy with the scent of spices and sickness. It was 19 A.D. In the governor's palace, Germanicus lay in a bed soaked with sweat, his body racked by a mysterious wasting fever. But this was no ordinary illness. Servants whispered in the corridors, their eyes wide with fear. They had found strange objects hidden in the walls of the prince's room, lead tablets inscribed with Germanicus's name, the charred remains of human bodies, and curses scratching invocations to the gods of the underworld. It seemed that hatred was not enough for his enemies. They wanted his soul. The hope of Rome was dying by inches.
As the light faded from his eyes, he did not speak of the gods or glory, he spoke of revenge. He pulled his wife Agrippina close. She was a woman of iron, the granddaughter of Augustus who had marched with the legions. "Do not provoke those stronger than you," he warned her, knowing her temper. But then he whispered the name of his murderer, Piso, and behind Piso the silent shadow of the Emperor Tiberius. When Germanicus died, a howl of grief went up that shook the empire from the Nile to the Rhine. But in Rome, the silence was deafening. When Agrippina returned to Italy, clutching the urn containing her husband's ashes, the ports were crowded with thousands of weeping citizens. They hailed her as the glory of the country, the solitary survivor of Augustus's blood. It was a hero's welcome for a widow, but Tiberius did not come to greet her. He did not attend the funeral. He stayed locked in the palace, peering out from behind the curtains, consumed by a paranoid belief that the people's grief for Germanicus was an act of rebellion against him. The trial of Piso, the man accused of the poisoning, was a farce. Piso expected Tiberius to save him. After all, he had only been following orders. But Tiberius, sensing the mood of the mob, cut him loose. Piso was found dead in his house, his throat cut, a suicide that conveniently silenced the only witness who could implicate the emperor. With Germanicus dead, the last restraint on Tiberius's soul snapped. He never wanted to be emperor. He hated the sycophancy of the Senate, the stench of the Roman crowds, the endless intrigues of the court. He looked around the marble halls of the Palatine and saw nothing but assassins. He needed a wall between himself and the world, and he found that wall in the form of a man named Lucius Aelius Sejanus.
Sejanus was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers tasked with protecting the emperor. But Sejanus was not just a soldier. He was a viper in a uniform. He was handsome, efficient, and utterly sociopathic. He recognized Tiberius's deep insecurity and played upon it like a master musician. He whispered daily into the emperor's ear, "The Senate despises you. Agrippina is plotting against you. Her sons are waiting for you to die. I am the only one you can trust." Slowly, methodically, Sejanus isolated the emperor. He convinced Tiberius that Rome was a death trap. Why stay in this cesspool of treason when he could rule from paradise? In 26 AD, at the age of 67, Tiberius made a decision that shocked the world. He packed his astrologers, his Greek scholars, and his darkest fantasies, and he left Rome forever. He traveled south, past the Bay of Naples, to a fortress of solitude rising out of the sea, the island of Capri. Capri was a place of breathtaking beauty, a limestone rock jutting out of the azure Mediterranean, but under Tiberius it became a prison of horrors. He built 12 villas on the island, the greatest being the Villa Jovis, perched on a sheer cliff dropping 1,000 feet into the sea. Here, the emperor could look out at the empire he ruled, but never had to touch it. But while Tiberius gazed at the stars and indulged in depravities that would make Caligula blush, he handed the keys of Rome to Sejanus. The Praetorian prefect was now the de facto emperor, and Sejanus had a plan. He didn't just want to serve the Caesar, he wanted to be the Caesar. To do that, he had to destroy the house of Germanicus. The widow Agrippina and her teenage sons, Nero and Drusus, not to be confused with the later Emperor Nero, were the only obstacles left. The purge began. It was not a sudden massacre, but a slow, suffocating tightening of the noose. Sejanus unleashed the delators, professional informers who would accuse citizens of treason for a share of their property. Rome became a city of whispers. To criticize the emperor was death. To cry for Germanicus was death. Even to look at a statue of Sejanus the wrong way could mean a trial. Antonia Minor, the mother of the murdered Germanicus and the sister-in-law of Tiberius, was a figure of unimpeachable virtue. She saw what was happening. She saw her grandchildren dying in dungeons. Risking her life, she wrote a secret letter to Tiberius, detailing Sejanus's plot to assassinate the emperor and seize the throne. She gave the letter to her most trusted slave, Pallas, and sent him to Capri. When Tiberius read the letter, the fog of indifference lifted. The old paranoia flared, but this time it was sharp and focused. He realized the man he had trusted was the knife at his throat. But Tiberius was a creature of deception. He did not strike immediately. He played a game of mouse and cat that was terrifying in its subtlety. He sent letters to the Senate praising Sejanus, then letters criticizing him. He hinted that Sejanus would be given tribunician power, the final step to co-rulership. On October 18, 31 AD, the trap sprang. The Senate convened in the Temple of Apollo. Sejanus arrived, beaming, expecting to be crowned, but the emperor was not there. Instead, the new Praetorian prefect, a brute named Macro, entered the chamber. He handed a letter from Tiberius to the consuls and then slipped outside to take command of the guard.
The letter was a masterpiece of rambling, confused senility, or so it seemed. It went on for hours, discussing wine, gout, and border skirmishes. Sejanus sat there, bored and arrogant. But slowly, the tone of the letter shifted. It began to complain about certain treacheries. It mentioned betrayal. And suddenly, in the final paragraph, the hammer dropped. Tiberius ordered the arrest of Sejanus for high treason. The senators, who had been cheering Sejanus minutes earlier, physically recoiled from him as if he were a leper. He was dragged out of the temple in chains. The mob, which hated him for the purges, descended upon him. They tore his body to pieces in the streets. His remains were dragged by a hook to the Gemonian stairs and thrown into the Tiber River. The man who would be king became fish food. But the fall of Sejanus did not bring the sun back to Rome. It only deepened the darkness. On Capri, Tiberius unleashed a reign of terror that made the previous years look merciful. He realized that everyone had betrayed him. The trials for complicity in Sejanus's plot went on for years. "Let them hate so long as they fear" became the unspoken motto of the regime. And amidst this slaughter, Tiberius summoned the last surviving son of Germanicus to live with him on the island. Imagine the psychological horror of Caligula's life. He was summoned to the cliff-top fortress to live with the man who had murdered his father, starved his mother, and imprisoned his brothers. He walked the halls of the Villa Jovis, watching the 70-year-old emperor indulge in grotesque debaucheries. He saw men tortured for the emperor's amusement. He saw bodies thrown off the cliffs. Caligula survived by becoming a mirror. He showed no emotion. He ignored the insults. He smiled when Tiberius spoke. He dressed like the emperor, spoke like the emperor, and agreed with everything the emperor said. He buried his rage so deep that it warped his soul. One observer noted, "Never was there a better servant nor a worse master." Tiberius was not fooled. He looked at the young man with the pale, hollow eyes and saw the monster growing inside. He looked at Caligula and famously said, "I am nursing a viper for the Roman people." Yet he did not kill him. Perhaps he wanted Rome to suffer. Perhaps he wanted a successor who would make his own memory look fond by comparison. In March of 37 AD, the end finally came. Tiberius, now 78, fell into a coma at a villa in Misenum. The courtiers, believing he was dead, rushed to congratulate Caligula. They hailed the young man as emperor. The ring was taken from Tiberius's finger. But then horror struck the room. A messenger ran in, pale and breathless. Tiberius had woken up. The old man was asking for food. The room froze.
The senators looked at Caligula, terror in their eyes. They had just declared a coup against a man who was still alive. Caligula stood there, frozen, realizing he was seconds away from execution. But Macro, the brutal Praetorian prefect, did not hesitate. He walked into the emperor's bedroom, looked at the frail, confused old man trying to sit up, and calmly smothered him with a pile of bedcloths. He held the pillow down until the struggling stopped. The monster of Capri was dead. The tyranny of the old man was over. The people of Rome rejoiced. They ran through the streets shouting, "To the Tiber with Tiberius!" They looked to the 24-year-old Caligula, the son of their beloved Germanicus, as a savior. They thought the nightmare was over. They had no idea that they had just traded a sullen tyrant for a raving lunatic. The viper had been nursed, and now it was ready to bite. The monster in the mirror. The sun broke over Rome in the spring of 37 AD, and for the first time in decades, it felt warm. The gloomy winter of Tiberius was over. Into the city rode Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, Caligula. He was young, only 24. He had the sharp features of his father and the fiery eyes of his mother. The mob went wild. They sacrificed 160,000 animals in 3 months to thank the gods for his ascension. They called him our star, our chick, our baby. He opened the treasury and threw gold to the people. He recalled the exiles. He burned the records of the treason trials in the Forum, swearing that he held no grudges. It was a carnival of hope. It was the Roman spring. But biology is a cruel time bomb. 7 months into his reign, Caligula fell ill. It was a severe brain fever, likely encephalitis or meningitis. He lay in a coma for weeks, hovering between life and death. The people slept in the streets outside the palace, praying for his recovery. When he finally woke up, the relief was palpable. But the man who opened his eyes was not the chick they had loved. Something in his wiring had snapped. The trauma of his youth, the murdered family, the years of terror on Capri, the repressed rage, combined with the brain damage to create a creature of pure, uninhibited impulse. The first signs were subtle, then terrifying. He began to execute people who had prayed for him to get better, claiming they should fulfill their vows to the gods by dying. He forced his father-in-law to cut his own throat. He executed Macro, the man who had made him emperor. The carnival turned into a slaughterhouse.
Caligula declared that he was a god, not a god to be worshipped after death like Augustus, but a living divinity walking among mortals. He ordered the heads cut off the statues of Jupiter and replaced with his own likeness. He would stand in the temple of Castor and Pollux, dressed in gold and silk, waiting for the senators to worship him. He would have conversations with the moon, whispering to it at night as if it were his lover. But his madness was not just religious, it was profoundly cruel. He held dinner parties that were exercises in psychological torture. He would burst into laughter during a meal, and when the terrified guests asked why, he would reply, "I was just thinking that with a single wave of my hand, I could have all your throats cut." The most famous story, that he made his horse Incitatus a consul, is often dismissed as legend. But consider the context. He built the horse a marble stable, an ivory manger, and gave it servants. Was he truly insane enough to believe the horse could govern, or was it the ultimate insult to the Senate? By suggesting a horse could do their job, he was telling the aristocratic elite of Rome that they were less than livestock. It was a joke, but a joke with a knife behind it. His spending was as manic as his cruelty. Tiberius had left a massive surplus in the treasury, 2.7 billion sesterces. Caligula spent it all in less than a year. He built useless aqueducts. He constructed a floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, lining up hundreds of merchant ships side by side, covering them with earth and riding his horse across it just to prove a prophecy wrong.
The prophecy had said he had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the Bay of Baiae. He bankrupted the empire for a punchline. To refill the coffers, his methods turned from erratic to predatory. He opened a brothel in the Imperial Palace and forced the wives and sons of senators to work in it, charging exorbitant fees. He auctioned off the family heirlooms of the old aristocracy, forcing them to bid against each other until they were destitute. But the terror was most acute in the palace corridors. The Praetorian Guard, the men sworn to protect him, were living in fear. Caligula had a particular disdain for Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer in the Guard. Chaerea was an old soldier, a veteran of the German wars, a man of dignity, but he had a high-pitched voice. Caligula tormented him relentlessly. He would give him watchwords for the day like Venus, implying he was a woman, or Priapus, mocking his virility. He would make Chaerea kiss his ring while moving his hand in an obscene gesture. It was a fatal miscalculation. You can starve a man, beat a man, or imprison a man, and he might endure it. But if you humiliate a proud man every single day, you are begging for a knife in the ribs. Chaerea began to whisper to other officers. The conspiracy grew. It wasn't about saving the Republic anymore, it was about survival. They knew that Caligula's madness had no bottom. He had recently shouted, "Would that the Roman people had but one neck," wishing he could decapitate the entire city in a single stroke. The time for talking was over. On January 24th, 41 AD, the Palatine Games were in full swing. The theater was packed with sweating bodies, roaring at the actors and dancers on stage. Caligula sat in his imperial box, eating fruit, seemingly relaxed, but the air was electric with tension. He had been suffering from a stomachache, debating whether to leave for a bath and lunch or stay for the next act. Fate, it seems, hung on a whim of digestion. At around noon, he stood up. He decided to take a shortcut back to the palace through a cryptoporticus, a narrow underground corridor that ran beneath the palaces on the Palatine Hill. It was a cool, dimly lit tunnel, a relief from the noise and heat of the games. He was accompanied by only a few German bodyguards and his uncle Claudius. Caligula stopped to speak to a troop of boys from Asia who were rehearsing for a performance. He was joking with them, his high-pitched laugh echoing off the stone walls. He didn't notice the shadows moving behind him. Cassius Chaerea stepped forward. The old soldier, the man Caligula had mocked as a woman for years, looked the emperor in the eye. He asked for the watchword. Caligula, true to form to the very end, gave an obscene reply. It was his last insult. Chaerea drew his sword. He shouted, "Hoc age," do it, a traditional sacrificial cry. He brought the blade down, slicing into Caligula's neck, between the shoulder and the ear. The blow didn't kill him instantly. Caligula fell to his knees, screaming, "I am still alive." It was a horrifying cry, perhaps a delusion of his own divinity, or perhaps sheer shock. But the other conspirators swarmed him. In the narrow, claustrophobic tunnel, it became a frenzy of steel. They stabbed him 30 times, hacking at his body even after he stopped moving. The god was dead. He lay in a pool of blood on the cold mosaic floor, a 28-year-old tyrant butchered like a pig in a slaughterhouse. The chaos that followed was absolute. The German bodyguards loyal to Caligula arrived seconds too late. Enraged, they began hacking at anyone they found, killing innocent conspirators and bystanders alike. The theater emptied in a panic. Rumors flew through the city. Some said Caligula was dead, others said it was a trick to test their loyalty.
But for the conspirators, the job wasn't finished. They knew that a tyrant's bloodline is a weed that grows back if you don't pull out the roots. A tribune named Lupus was sent to the palace to find Caligula's wife, Caesonia. He found her weeping over the body of her husband, soaked in his blood. She did not run. She reportedly offered her throat to the soldier, asking only to join her husband. Lupus obliged her. Then came the act that truly cemented the brutality of the day. Caligula had a daughter, Julia Drusilla. She was an infant, barely 2 years old. The soldiers looked at the child and saw not innocence, but the seed of future vengeance. In a moment of cold, pragmatic savagery, a soldier grabbed the child by her feet and swung her head against a wall. The line of Caligula was extinguished. Rome held its breath. The Senate met in the temple of Jupiter, energized by a sudden intoxicating dream. The tyrant was dead. The republic could be restored. They debated late into the night, giving speeches about liberty and freedom, imagining a world without Caesars. But they forgot one thing. The Praetorian Guard did not want a republic. A republic meant no more donatives, no more bribes, no more power for the soldiers. The Guard needed an emperor to exist. While the senators made speeches, the soldiers were looting the palace, looking for gold and for a successor. In the chaos of the assassination, Caligula's uncle, Claudius, had been separated from the group. Terrified by the screams and the blood, the 50-year-old historian fled to a nearby balcony. He hid behind a heavy curtain, trembling, listening to the soldiers ransacking the rooms. He saw the feet of a Praetorian named Gratus moving across the floor. Gratus saw the feet sticking out from under the fabric. He pulled the curtain back. There, cowering in the shadows, was the laughingstock of Rome. Claudius, the man who drooled, the man who stammered, the man his own mother called a monster of a man, not finished by nature, but merely begun. He expected to be killed. He fell to his knees, begging for mercy. But Gratus did not draw his sword. He looked at the beloved Germanicus's brother. He looked at the only surviving adult male of the Julio-Claudian line. He smiled. "Hail Caesar," the soldier said. Claudius looked up, confused. The soldiers hoisted him onto a litter. They didn't carry him to execution. They carried him to the Praetorian camp. The Senate was debating liberty, but the army had found its puppet. The monster was dead, but the fool was about to inherit the earth. The fool who survived. The night of January 24th was the longest in the history of the Roman Senate. On the Capitoline Hill, the consuls puffed up their chests, invoking the spirits of Brutus and Cato, declaring that the tyranny of the Caesars was over. They dreamed of a restored republic where free men debated laws instead of trembling before a boy god. But down in the fortified camp of the Praetorian Guard, a very different reality was taking shape. The soldiers didn't want freedom, they wanted a paycheck. And sitting on a camp stool, surrounded by thousands of swords, was their new paymaster, Claudius. He was 50 years old. His head twitched uncontrollably. When he spoke, he stammered, spraying saliva. His left leg dragged behind him when he walked. To the elite of Rome, he was an embarrassment, a cosmic joke played on the house of Augustus. His own mother, Antonia, used to call him a monstrosity of a human being. Augustus had kept him hidden in the back of processions, wrapped in a cloak so the public wouldn't see the defect. But Claudius had a secret weapon that no one, not even the cunning Sejanus or the mad Caligula, had suspected. He was brilliant. For decades, Claudius played the fool. He realized early on that in the Julio-Claudian Dynasty, competence was a death sentence. If you were smart, you were a threat. If you were an idiot, you were safe. So he exaggerated his limp, he thickened his stammer, he buried himself in books, writing exhaustive histories of the Etruscans and the Carthaginians. He survived the purges of Tiberius and the madness of Caligula by making himself beneath contempt. He was the invisible man of the Palatine. But now the mask had to come off. The Senate's resolve crumbled the moment they realized the army was with Claudius. They had no legions, they had no swords, they only had speeches.
One by one, the senators slipped away from the temple and trudged to the Praetorian camp to pay homage to the idiot. Claudius promised every soldier 15,000 sestertians, more than 10 years' salary, for their loyalty. It was the first time an emperor had openly bought the throne. The republic died not with a bang, but with the clinking of gold coins. Once on the throne, Rome waited for the disaster. They expected Claudius to trip over his toga and collapse the empire. Instead, they got one of the most effective administrators in Roman history. The man who had spent 30 years reading history decided he wanted to make it. He reorganized the bureaucracy, trusting talented freedmen, former slaves, over the arrogant senators who had mocked him. He built a massive new harbor at Ostia to secure Rome's grain supply, ending the famines that terrified the mob. But his greatest act of defiance against his critics came in 43 AD. Julius Caesar once scouted the mysterious island of Britain, but no Roman had ever conquered it. It was a land of mist, druids, and painted warriors, lying beyond the edge of the known world. Claudius, the cripple who had never held a command, ordered the legions to cross the ocean.
He didn't just send generals, he went himself. Imagine the scene, the limping emperor riding an elephant into the burning capital of Camulodunum, modern Colchester, accepting the surrender of 11 British kings. It was a masterstroke of propaganda. He returned to Rome not as Claudius the Fool, but as Britannicus, the conqueror of the ocean. He held a triumph that eclipsed anything Caligula had ever done. He had proven to the world that a broken body could house a Caesar's soul. However, history is rarely kind to the lonely. Claudius had a fatal weakness that no amount of intellect could fix, a desperate, aching need for affection. He had been unloved by his mother, mocked by his family, and ignored by women his entire life. Now that he was emperor, women suddenly found him fascinating, and Claudius, starving for love, devoured their lies. He married Valeria Messalina. She was a teenager, barely 18, while he was in his 50s. She was beautiful, vibrant, and utterly devoid of a conscience. To Claudius, she was a prize, a sign that he was finally a real man. To Messalina, Claudius was a boring old man who controlled the checkbook. While the emperor was busy rewriting the alphabet or judging court cases deep into the night, Messalina was unleashing a reign of debauchery that would make Caligula look like a monk. She didn't just have affairs, she hunted men. She used her power to force senators, actors, and soldiers into her bed. If they refused, she whispered to Claudius that they were traitors, and the paranoid emperor would have them executed. She turned the palace into her personal playground. Rumors swirled that she even competed with a famous prostitute to see who could service more men in a single night, and won. Rome knew. The Senate knew. The army knew. The only person who didn't know was Claudius. He doted on her. He held their children, Octavia and Britannicus, with pride, believing he finally had the happy family he had always craved. He was the master of the world, ruling an empire that stretched from the Sahara to the Scottish border. But he was a stranger in his own bedroom, and his blindness was about to lead to one of the most scandalous episodes in Roman history. In 48 AD, Claudius left Rome to inspect the new harbor at Ostia. It was a short trip, a few days at most, but for Messalina, it was enough time to commit an act so brazen that historians still struggle to comprehend it. She didn't just take a lover, she married him. His name was Gaius Silius, the most handsome senator in Rome. Messalina had forced him to divorce his wife and empty his house for her. But she was bored with secrecy. She wanted the pomp, the ceremony, the thrill of the forbidden. In the gardens of the palace, while the emperor was checking grain shipments, Messalina dressed in a bridal veil. Silius wore the toga of a groom. They sacrificed to the gods. They signed a marriage contract in front of witnesses. They held a massive Bacchic wedding feast, with wine flowing like water and guests dancing in a drunken frenzy. It wasn't just adultery, it was a coup. By marrying a consul designate, Messalina was effectively declaring Silius the new emperor. But the freedmen of Claudius, Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus were watching. They knew that if Silius took the throne, they would be the first to die. Narcissus, the secretary of correspondence, took the gamble of his life. He raced to Ostia and threw himself at Claudius's feet. "Caesar," he cried, "do you know that you are divorced? Silius is master of Rome." Claudius panicked. The conqueror of Britain dissolved into a terrified old man, asking repeatedly, "Am I still emperor? Am I still emperor?" He rushed back to Rome. Messalina heard the wheels of his carriage approaching. The party stopped. The music died. The guests fled into the shadows, but it was too late. Messalina, realizing the game was up, tried to meet Claudius on the road, holding their children to beg for mercy. But Narcissus blocked her path, shouting out her crimes to drown out her weeping. Messalina retreated to the Dardens of Lucullus, gardens she had stolen from a rival senator. She lay on the ground, sobbing, her mother sitting beside her. Her mother, who had disapproved of her life, now gave her cold Roman advice. "Your life is over. All that remains is to make a decent end." She handed Messalina a dagger. The empress put the blade to her throat, but her hand shook so violently she couldn't do it. A praetorian tribune kicked open the gate, looked at the pathetic woman groveling in the dirt, and ran her through with his sword. When the news was brought to Claudius at dinner that Messalina had perished, he did not ask how. He did not cry. He simply stared at his wine cup and asked for it to be refilled. A few days later, he absent-mindedly asked why the empress hadn't come to dinner. The trauma was so deep that his mind had simply erased her. But a Caesar cannot be alone. The vacuum Messalina left was dangerous, and into that void stepped a woman who made Messalina look like an amateur. Agrippina the Younger. She was the sister of Caligula, the daughter of Germanicus, and, crucially, the niece of Claudius. She had survived the incestuous ambitions of her brother and the exile of the islands. She was hard, cold, and terrifyingly ambitious. She didn't want lovers, she wanted power, and she knew that as a woman she could only wield it through a man. She set her sights on her uncle.
The laws of Rome forbade incest between an uncle and a niece, but the Senate, terrified of Agrippina, changed the law in a single day. In 49 AD, they were married. The palace changed overnight. The drunken parties of Messalina were replaced by a rigid military austerity. Agrippina was not a plaything. She was a partner. She sat on a dais next to Claudius to receive foreign ambassadors, something no woman had ever done. But her loyalty was not to her husband. It was to her son from a previous marriage, a boy named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. She renamed him Nero. Agrippina began a systematic campaign to destroy Claudius's natural son, Britannicus. She maneuvered Nero into the spotlight. She had Claudius adopt Nero as his heir, arguing that Britannicus was too young. She appointed a stoic philosopher named Seneca to tutor Nero. She appointed a hardened soldier named Burrus to command the Praetorian Guard. She was building a government in waiting. Claudius was old, but he was not blind. By 54 AD, he began to regret the marriage. He looked at his biological son, Britannicus, now approaching manhood, and wept.
promising him that he would soon receive the toga virilis, the toga of manhood. "That the Roman people may at last have a true Caesar," he muttered. Agrippina heard him. She knew her time was running out. If Britannicus came of age, Nero was finished, and if Nero was finished, she was finished. On the night of October 12, 54 AD, a special dish was prepared for the emperor's dinner. Claudius loved mushrooms. Agrippina hired a notorious poisoner named Locusta to prepare a particularly succulent bolate mushroom infused with a deadly toxin. Claudius ate it. He began to choke, but the poison didn't work fast enough. He vomited, expelling some of the toxin. Agrippina stood there, watching her husband struggle, her face a mask of panic. If he survived, he would kill them all. She signaled to the emperor's doctor, Xenophon, whom she had already bribed. The doctor rushed over, pretending to help the emperor vomit by tickling his throat with a feather, but the feather was painted with a fast-acting poison. He shoved it down Claudius's throat. The struggle ceased. The scholar emperor, the fool who survived, the conqueror of Britain, slumped forward onto the table. He was dead. Agrippina did not announce the death immediately. She locked the palace doors. She placed compresses on the dead man's head, pretending he was just resting. She waited until the sun rose, until the astrological signs were perfect. At noon on October 13th, the palace doors swung open, but it was not Britannicus who stepped out. It was a 17-year-old boy with golden hair and a nervous smile. Nero walked out to the waiting Praetorian Guard. Burrus, the commander Agrippina had installed, gave the signal. "Hail Caesar!" The soldiers cheered. They didn't care about bloodlines. They cared about the donative Agrippina had promised them. Nero was lifted onto their shoulders. The final act of the tragedy had begun. The artist had taken the stage, and Rome was about to burn. The artist of the apocalypse. The reign of Nero began not with fire, but with a golden dawn. For the first 5 years, known as the Quinquennium Neronis, the empire seemed to hold its breath. The young emperor was charming, generous, and seemingly uninterested in the bloody politics of his ancestors. He lowered taxes, he banned capital punishment in the Senate, he told the world he wanted to be a poet, not a soldier. Behind the throne, the stoic philosopher Seneca and the grim prefect Burrus steered the ship of state with steady hands. It looked, for a brief, shimmering moment, as if the curse of the Julio-Claudians had been broken. But there was a third hand on the wheel, and its grip was suffocating. Agrippina had killed Claudius to make her son a figurehead. She had killed him to make herself the Empress of Rome. She appeared on coins facing Nero as an equal. She sat behind a curtain in Senate meetings, listening to every word. She attempted to sit on the imperial dais with foreign kings. She was the mother, the maker, the master. But Nero was growing up. He was discovering the intoxicating taste of absolute power, and he found his mother's shadow intolerable. The boy who wanted to sing and race chariots chafed under the gaze of the woman who had poisoned a husband to put him there. The palace became a silent war zone. When Nero fell in love with a freedwoman named Acte, Agrippina screamed in rage. When he ignored her advice, she threatened to support Britannicus, the rightful heir she had pushed aside, against him. That threat was her death warrant. Nero, terrified that his mother would replace him just as she had replaced Claudius, moved first. Britannicus collapsed at a dinner party, poisoned in front of the entire court. Nero casually told the guests that it was just an epileptic fit. Agrippina watched the boy die and realized with a cold horror that she had created a monster who learned her lessons too well. But killing a stepbrother is one thing. Matricide is a crime of nature. Nero couldn't just execute the daughter of Germanicus, he had to make it look like an accident.
In 59 AD, the emperor invited his mother to a feast at Baiae. He was charming, affectionate, and repentant. When the night ended, he escorted her to a magnificent boat he had prepared for her journey home. It was a death trap. The boat was designed to collapse at sea, crushing her or drowning her. The mechanism triggered as planned. The lead roof of the cabin crashed down, but the sofa Agrippina was resting on was sturdy. It protected her. The ship capsized, but Agrippina, a strong swimmer, managed to slip silently into the dark water, while her maid, screaming for help, was bludgeoned to death by oarsmen who thought she was the empress. Agrippina swam to shore, battered but alive. When Nero heard she had survived, he collapsed in terror. He knew she would come for him with the fury of the Furies. There could be no more accidents. He sent soldiers to her villa. They found her in a dimly lit room, waiting. She saw the glint of steel and knew the end had come. She did not beg. She did not weep. In a final act of defiant tragedy, she tore open her robe, exposing her womb to the centurion's sword. "Smite my womb," she commanded, for it bore Nero. The soldier struck. The mother of the emperor died in the blood she had spilled to raise him. Nero arrived to look at the corpse. Legend says he inspected her limbs, praising her beauty, treating his mother's body like a statue in a gallery. But the ghost of Agrippina would never leave him. From that night on, Nero claimed to be hounded by the Furies, hearing trumpets and wailing from her grave. The golden boy was gone. The artist of the apocalypse had been born. Free from his mother, Nero's restraint evaporated. Burrus died, likely poisoned. Seneca was forced into retirement. Nero surrounded himself with sycophants who fed his delusions. He divorced and executed his innocent wife, Octavia, to marry the beautiful, ambitious Poppaea Sabina. But even Poppaea was not safe. One night, in a fit of rage because she complained about him coming home late from the races, Nero kicked her in the stomach. She was pregnant. She and the unborn child died. Nero wept. He gave her a state funeral. He loved her in his own twisted way, but he loved his own impulses more. He began to perform publicly, singing and playing the lyre on stage. For a Roman aristocrat, this was a humiliation worse than death. Actors were considered on the same social level as prostitutes. Yet here was the emperor forcing senators to sit for hours in the theater, forbidding them to leave even if they were sick or dying, demanding their applause as he screeched through Greek tragedies. He believed he was Apollo incarnate. But the gods were preparing a stage for him that was far grander than a theater. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, a fire broke out in the shops near the Circus Maximus. It was a hot, windy summer night. The flames, fed by olive oil and timber, jumped the narrow streets. They climbed the hills. They devoured the tenements of the poor and the palaces of the rich. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome burned. The city became a furnace. The lead from the roofs of temples melted and ran down the streets like rivers of gray lava. The screams of the dying were drowned out by the roar of the inferno. Ancient temples, trophies of war, the history of the Republic, all turned to ash. Where was Nero? History tells us he was at Antium when the fire started, but he rushed back to Rome. He organized relief efforts, opening his gardens to the refugees. But the rumor mill was stronger than the truth. People whispered that they had seen men throwing torches into buildings, claiming they were acting on orders. They whispered that Nero wanted to destroy the old, ugly city to build a new one named after himself, Neropolis. And the most enduring image of all was born. Nero standing on the Tower of Maecenas, dressed in theatrical robes, watching his capital burn while playing the lyre and singing of the fall of Troy. Whether he actually played the fiddle is irrelevant. The metaphor was perfect.
He was the artist treating the suffering of thousands as the backdrop for his own aesthetic experience. When the smoke finally cleared, 2/3 of Rome was a charred wasteland. The city was a skeleton of its former self, a labyrinth of ash and collapsed stone. The people were homeless, starving, and furious. They wandered the ruins with hollow eyes, looking for loved ones who had vanished into the inferno. Rage began to replace grief. They needed a scapegoat. Nero, sensing the mood turning dangerous and hearing the whispers that he was the arsonist, found a target. He pointed a finger at a small, secretive religious sect that the Romans viewed with deep suspicion: the Christians. What followed was a spectacle of cruelty that shocked even the hardened Roman populace. Nero didn't just execute them, he turned their deaths into entertainment. He opened his imperial gardens for a night festival. Christians were sewn into the skins of wild beasts and thrown to dogs to be torn apart. Others were nailed to crosses, and in the most horrific display of all, he had them coated in pitch and oil, tied to stakes, and set on fire to serve as human torches to light his pardon party. Nero wandered through the crowd in a charioteer's outfit, mingling with the guests, while human beings burned alive around him. Even the Roman mob, usually thirsty for blood, turned away in disgust. It wasn't justice. It was madness.
With the city cleared by fire, Nero began his greatest project, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was not just a palace, it was a sprawling country estate dropped into the middle of the city. It had forests, a lake where the Colosseum stands today, and a dining room with a revolving ceiling that sprayed perfume and flower petals on guests. In the vestibule stood a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself, the Colossus. When it was finished, Nero looked around the gilded halls and famously said, "Good, now I can at last begin to live like a human being." But the empire was bankrupt. To pay for his golden fantasy, Nero looted the temples of Greece and Asia. He debased the currency. He executed wealthy senators on trumped-up charges to seize their estates. The illusion of the Golden Age was shattered. The legions on the frontier, unpaid and disgusted by the stories of an emperor who acted like a female opera singer, finally snapped. In 68 AD, the governor of Gaul, Vindex, revolted. He was crushed, but the spark had been lit. Galba, the governor of Spain, declared himself the enemy of Nero. The Senate, sensing blood in the water, finally found its spine. They declared Nero a public enemy. Nero woke up in the palace to find it empty. His bodyguards were gone. His friends had fled. He wandered through the silent marble halls, knocking on doors, but no one answered. The god was alone. He fled the city in disguise, riding to the villa of a freedman named Phaon. He huddled in a dark back room, unshaven, barefoot, and terrified. He could hear the horsemen coming. He ordered a grave to be dug for him, weeping as he measured his own body against the earth. He begged his secretary to kill him, but the man refused. He tried to work up the courage to do it himself, muttering, "I have lived shamefully, and I die shamefully." Finally, the sound of hoofbeats grew loud. The centurion was at the door. Nero placed a dagger to his throat. With the help of his secretary, Epaphroditus, he drove the blade home. As the centurion burst into the room, he found the emperor bleeding out on the floor. The soldier tried to staunch the wound with his cloak. Nero looked up at him with glazing eyes and gasped his final words, "Too late. This is fidelity." With that last ironic gasp, Nero died. And with him died the Julio-Claudian Dynasty. The bloodline that had produced Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius was extinct. There were no more heirs. The divine family had consumed itself entirely. Rome erupted in joy. The mob ran through the streets wearing liberty caps. But their joy was short-lived. The secret of the empire was out. An emperor could be made elsewhere than at Rome.
The generals were marching. The year of the 4 emperors was beginning. The marble city would burn again, not by accident, but by civil war. We stand now at the end of the line. From the cold brilliance of Augustus to the pathetic suicide of Nero, the story of the Julio-Claudians is a warning written in blood. They were a family gifted with everything: power, wealth, beauty, and genius, yet they destroyed themselves from the inside out. We look at their marble busts in museums today, the calm, idealized faces of gods. But if you look closer, past the stone eyes, you can see the truth. You can see the fear of Tiberius, the madness of Caligula, the loneliness of Claudius, and the vanity of Nero. They were not gods, they were men. And they learned the hardest lesson of all, that absolute power does not just corrupt, it isolates. It builds a golden cage where trust dies, where love is a weakness, and where the only way to survive is to become a monster. The dynasty is gone, the golden house is buried, but the echo of their tragedy remains, whispering in the ruins of the Palatine Hill. It reminds us that no empire is eternal, and no family can outrun its own demons. The sun sets on Rome. The stage is empty. The applause has faded into silence.